I don't know exactly when I stopped being a person to my husband and became a signature. I've tried to trace it back. Was it when I quit teaching to help him build his practice? When I stopped correcting him in front of clients? When I learned to smile at dinner parties and ask people about their work instead of talking about my own? I genuinely don't know. What I do know is that by the night of that dinner, a Tuesday in March, still cold, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Michigan like a warning, I had become so agreeable, so useful, that Daniel Webb had completely forgotten I was fluent in French. That was his mistake. It was the only one he needed to make. My name is Elena Webb. I'm 38 years old. I have a PhD in art history from the University of Illinois, and I spent a year abroad in Lyon when I was 24, which is where I became conversational, and then, over the years, through journals and films and a stubborn refusal to let it go, genuinely fluent. Daniel knew this when we met. I reminded him once, maybe twice. He nodded the way he nodded at a lot of things I said, and then he moved on. We'd been married 11 years by the time of the dinner, 11 years in our house in Lincoln Square, a dark gray 3-flat we'd renovated ourselves, or rather, that I'd managed while he billed ours. We had a good life. That's not sarcasm. I mean it plainly. It looked good. It felt mostly good. And if some part of me had gone quiet somewhere along the way, I'd made my peace with that. Or I thought I had. Daniel was a real estate attorney. Commercial work, acquisitions, zoning disputes, development deals. His firm, Webb & Callaway, occupied half a floor of a building on LaSalle Street, and he'd spent the last 2 years cultivating a French developer named Isabelle Renard, who was interested in a mixed-use project near the Fulton Market District. She was based in Paris but came to Chicago twice a year. Daniel called her brilliant. He said it with a particular softness I recognized from somewhere but couldn't immediately place. He invited me to the dinner because, he said, it would look good. She's curious about us, he told me that morning. Likes to know who she's working with on a personal level. Just come and be charming. Just come and be charming. After 11 years, I suppose I had earned that job description. The restaurant was in the Gold Coast, the kind of place where the menus don't have prices, and the lighting makes everyone look like they're about to say something important. We arrived first. Daniel ordered sparkling water and checked his phone twice before Isabelle walked in. She was around 40, with the particular confidence of someone who has decided she doesn't need to perform for anyone. She kissed Daniel on both cheeks and turned to me with a smile I couldn't quite read, warm on the surface, measuring underneath. We ordered. They talked business in English. I listened, asked questions when it seemed appropriate, laughed at the right moments. Daniel relaxed. He always relaxed when I was useful. Then the sommelier brought a second bottle, and Daniel stepped away to take a call. His partner, something urgent, and Isabelle and I were alone. She watched him go. Then she looked down at her wine glass and said, in French, almost to herself, "Il a vraiment beaucoup de chance avec elle." He's very lucky with her. A compliment, I thought at first. Then she smiled, just slightly, and added, "Elle signe ce qu'il lui met devant les yeux, non?" She signs whatever he puts in front of her, right? The room didn't change. The candles kept burning. Somewhere behind me, a woman laughed. I held my wine glass and I looked at Isabelle Renard, and I did not move a single muscle, because something in the base of my skull had gone very, very cold. Don't react. She doesn't know you understand. Don't move. Oui, she said, apparently pleased with herself, pulling out her phone. C'est parfait pour le transfert. Yes, it's perfect for the transfer. Daniel came back 30 seconds later. He touched my shoulder as he sat down. He told Isabelle something had come up, but it was handled. He refilled my glass. I smiled. I said the food was wonderful. I asked Isabelle how long she was in Chicago this time, and for the rest of that dinner I sat there, perfectly composed, listening to every word, because the French they spoke between themselves for the next 2 hours, when they thought I wasn't following, told me a story I was never supposed to hear. Before I tell you what I learned, I want to stop for just a moment. If you've found this channel and you're the kind of person who stays to the end of a story like this, I think you know why I keep sharing these. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want to be here when part 2 comes out, subscribing takes 2 seconds. Okay, back to that table. By the time we left the restaurant, I knew 3 things with absolute certainty. 1. Daniel was moving money through a shell company, and my name was on it. 2. Isabelle Renard was not just his client. 3. Whatever was in those documents I'd signed without reading, all those papers over the last year, the ones he'd slid across the kitchen counter after dinner, just routine stuff, babe. Don't worry about it. They were no longer going to work the way he planned. I didn't say a word on the drive home. Daniel talked about the project. He seemed satisfied, loose, like a man who believed everything was going exactly right. He was still talking when we pulled into the garage. That was the night I went upstairs, waited until he fell asleep, and opened his home office for the first time since he'd changed the lock. What I found inside that room didn't just break my heart, it ended the life I thought I was living. The lock was a simple keypad, the kind Daniel had installed 2 years ago, when he said he needed to keep client files secure. I'd accepted that the way I'd accepted a lot of things. Reasonable explanation, move on. What I hadn't accepted, quietly, without telling myself I was doing it, was the code, his mother's birthday. He used it for everything. I'd watched his fingers on his phone 1,000 times without meaning to. Some part of my brain had filed it away like a receipt you stuff in a drawer and forget until the moment you need it. The door opened on the first try. Of course it did. I want to be honest about what I felt standing in that doorway, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't rage. It was something closer to the feeling you get when a doctor's face changes mid-sentence, that half second before the words come, when your body already knows. The office was tidy. Daniel was always tidy. Bookshelves along one wall, his degrees framed above the desk, a credenza with a locked drawer I'd never had reason to open. On the desk, a closed laptop, a legal pad, a ceramic mug from a conference in Austin he'd attended last October. I remembered that conference. I'd driven him to O'Hare. We'd had coffee in the car. He'd kissed me goodbye at the curb. Stop. Focus. I started with the credenza. The drawer opened with a small key that was sitting, almost laughably, in the pencil cup on the desk. Inside, a hanging file with 5 folders. I took photographs of everything with my phone before I touched a single page. Then I sat on the floor and started reading. It took me about 40 minutes to understand what I was looking at, and another 10 to stop shaking enough to think clearly. The shell company was called Lakeview Meridian LLC. It had been incorporated in Delaware 14 months ago, listed as co-owners Daniel James Webb and Elena Marie Webb, my name, my signature, or something that looked very much like it, on the founding documents, the operating agreement, and 3 subsequent deed transfers involving properties on the north side. I had never heard of Lakeview Meridian LLC in my life. The properties were real. I knew 2 of the addresses. One was a mixed-use building near Andersonville that had sold for $2.3 million the previous spring, right around the time Daniel had told me we needed to be careful with spending for a while. The transfer documents listed the proceeds as reinvested into our company. He put my name on it. He used me as a shield, and I didn't even know I was holding one. The 3rd folder was thinner. Inside, a lease agreement for a short-term rental in River North, a 2-bedroom, 12-month lease beginning last April. The name on the lease was Isabelle Renard. Daniel's personal email address was listed as the emergency contact. I put everything back exactly as I found it. I relocked the drawer, replaced the key, and closed the office door behind me. Then I walked to our bedroom, changed into the clothes I'd laid out for the morning, and lay down on top of the covers next to my sleeping husband. I stared at the ceiling for 4 hours. I didn't cry. I want to make sure I say that clearly, because I think people expect tears at a moment like that, and I understand why. But what I felt wasn't grief yet. Grief comes when something is over. What I felt that night was the opposite, like something was just beginning. like a door had opened onto a very long hallway, and I could either stand in the entrance or start walking. I started walking. The next morning, I called in sick to the consulting project I was working on. I'd gone back to doing freelance curatorial work 2 years earlier, small stuff, museum loans and private collections, and I drove to the Harold Washington Library downtown. I didn't want to search from our home network. I spent 6 hours there. By the end of the day, I understood that Lakeview Meridian LLC had processed just under $4 million in real estate transactions over 14 months, that my forged signature appeared on documents that could, depending on how a court read them, make me either a victim or an accomplice, and that Daniel Webb was a great deal more sophisticated about financial concealment than I had ever given him credit for. I also found something he hadn't planned for, because I was listed as a 50% owner of the company, because my name was on the founding documents. I had legal standing to access the company's records, all of them, not as a suspicious wife, as an owner. He handed me the key and didn't realize it. I sat with that for a long moment in a carrel on the 4th floor, the city gray outside the window, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope exactly, more like the sensation of weight redistributing, like I'd been leaning on a wall I didn't know was there, and it had just quietly held. Maybe you've experienced a betrayal so complete it rewired the way you saw the last 10 years of your life. I hope you haven't, but if you have, you know that the anger comes later. What comes first is this terrible, clarifying calm. I had that calm now, and I was going to use it. I didn't call a lawyer that week. I almost did, twice, but something stopped me each time. Not yet. You don't know enough yet. Instead, I called my college roommate, Deb Fallon, who'd spent 15 years as a forensic accountant in the Loop before moving to a smaller firm in Evanston. I hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. She answered on the second ring. Elena. A pause. You okay? Not really, I said. I need to ask you something, and I need you to pretend for now that you're not going to ask me why. Silence. Then, go ahead. I told her about Lakeview Meridian. Not everything, just enough. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You need a financial crimes attorney, not a divorce attorney." I know. They're going to tell you the same thing I'm about to tell you. Tell me anyway. Don't move anything. Don't confront him. Don't let him know what you know. She paused. And Elena, get your own phone. Pay cash? I bought a prepaid that afternoon at a Walgreens on Clark Street. I paid with 2 20s I'd taken from the grocery envelope we kept in the kitchen drawer. Daniel didn't notice. He never tracked the grocery money. Over the next 3 weeks, I built what I privately started calling my file. I met Deb twice for coffee in Evanston, always in the morning, always cash, always when Daniel thought I was at a client meeting. She walked me through the financial architecture of what he'd built, and the more she explained, the more precisely I understood how exposed he actually was. The forged signatures were the linchpin. If I was a victim of forgery, the entire structure of Lakeview Meridian became evidence in a fraud case. But if I could prove I'd been deliberately added as a co-owner to create plausible deniability, to give Daniel a story about a family investment vehicle, if anyone looked too closely, then the exposure wasn't just civil. It was federal. Deb had a name, a financial crimes attorney named Patricia Voss, based in the Loop, who she described as the quietest, terrifying person I've ever met. I wrote the name on a Post-it and stuck it inside the cover of an art history book on my studio shelf. Just the name, no context. In case he ever went looking, he wouldn't know what he was looking at. It was a Thursday evening in early April when Daniel came home and said, almost casually, that he thought we should talk about the future. I was making dinner. I kept my back to him. What about it? I said. He leaned against the counter. I could feel him choosing his words. I think we've been going in different directions for a while. I think we both know that. There it is. I see, I said. I think it might be time to. Are you asking for a divorce, Daniel? The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. I think it's worth considering, he said. Very careful. Very measured. The attorney voice? I suddenly realized. He'd been using it on me for years, and I'd never heard it until now. I turned around and looked at him. He was already watching me with that particular expression. Patient, slightly sympathetic, ready to be reasonable. Ready to manage me? Okay, I said. He blinked. Okay? If that's what you want. He'd expected tears, arguments, bargaining. I watched the small recalibration happen behind his eyes. I think it's for the best, he said carefully. Sure, I said. We can talk about it. And I turned back to the stove. He filed the paperwork 9 days later. His attorney moved to freeze our joint assets within 48 hours of filing. A standard move, his office said. Nothing personal. The freeze covered everything except one thing they hadn't thought to look for. Because 3 days before Daniel filed, I had driven downtown and sat across a conference table from Patricia Voss. I'd handed her a folder containing photographs of every document in that credenza drawer, a printed summary of everything Deb had explained to me, and a phone that contained a 37-second voice recording I hadn't yet told anyone about. Patricia had looked at the recording for a long moment. When did you get this? She asked. The night of a dinner, I said. In March. I didn't know I was getting it. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I must have bumped the voice memo app somehow when I reached for my water glass. She looked up. He doesn't know it exists, I said. Patricia Voss set down the folder and folded her hands on the table. Mrs. Webb, she said quietly, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm going to tell you. And that was the moment the entire balance of the situation changed. Patricia Voss had a corner office on the 32nd floor of a building on West Monroe with a view of the Chicago River that on clear days stretched all the way to the lake. She was 50-something, silver-haired, and she had the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where losing your composure cost people everything. She told me to call her Patricia. She never called me Elena. It was always Mrs. Webb. And after a while, I understood that was intentional. She was reminding me, every time she said it, exactly who I was in this situation. Not a wronged wife. A legal entity with standing. The recording, she said, that first afternoon, is the load-bearing wall. She explained it carefully, Daniel's voice, clearly identifiable, instructing Isabelle to ensure the deed transfer documents reflected my signature, knowing I hadn't signed them. 37 seconds of a man explaining, in the measured tone of someone who has done this before, how to complete a fraud. Illinois was a one-party consent state. I had been present. The recording was legal. Combined with the co-ownership documents, the financial transfer records, and the forgeries themselves, Patricia said, what you have is not a divorce case. What you have is a federal wire fraud exposure, potential money laundering charges, and a bar complaint that would end his career before any of the criminal proceedings began. I sat very still. So what do I do? Nothing, she said. For now, nothing that looks like anything. That was April. I want to tell you what the next 6 weeks felt like, because I think people imagine that once you have a plan, the waiting becomes easier. It doesn't. It just becomes different. Instead of drowning, you're treading water in the dark, and the effort is constant and invisible, and you can't tell anyone how tired your arms are. Daniel moved through our house like a man who believed he had already won. He was careful. He'd always been careful, but there was something new underneath it now, a looseness. He started working from home more often. He took calls in the backyard with a coffee in his hand, relaxed, laughing sometimes. He began making small comments about the house, framed as practical. Had I thought about where I'd want to live after? Did I have a sense of my budget? It might make sense to start looking at apartments on the north side, managing me toward the exit, tidying up. Let him, Patricia had said, let him think it's going the way he planned. So I did. I looked at apartments, I texted him links. I had a conversation with him one Sunday morning about whether I'd want to keep the dining table, and I was so natural about it, so cooperative, that something in his face relaxed in a way that told me he'd been carrying more anxiety than he was showing. Good. Let him set it down. Deb called me on a Wednesday in early May, while I was walking along the lakefront path near Montrose Harbor. It was the first genuinely warm day of the year, and the path was full of people who'd been waiting months for exactly this. Runners, cyclists, a man playing guitar on a bench with his eyes closed. "I found something," she said, without preamble. She'd been doing informal forensic work on Lakeview Meridian's paper trail, nothing that could be traced back to her, just pattern analysis on the public-facing documents. What she'd found was a fourth property. A condo in Streeterville that didn't appear in the folders I'd photographed because the transaction hadn't closed yet. It was still in contract. The purchase price was $1.8 million. The listed buyer was Lakeview Meridian LLC, my name, presumably, on the purchase agreement. "He's still moving," Deb said. "He hasn't stopped." "Of course he hasn't. He thinks he's untouchable. Send me what you have," I said. "I'll get it to Patricia." I stood there for a moment after I hung up, looking out at the lake. The water was that particular shade of blue-gray it gets in early May, not quite warm enough to be inviting, but lit up by the sun into something almost beautiful. A woman jogged past me with a stroller. 2 kids were throwing a frisbee near the grass. Normal life, still happening, indifferent. I turned around and walked back to my car. Patricia filed the motion on a Tuesday morning in late May, and she did it without warning Daniel's attorney. That was intentional. The motion cited my co-ownership of Lakeview Meridian LLC and requested emergency access to the company's full financial records as a 50% stakeholder, not as a divorcing spouse, but as a business owner exercising her legal rights. She also filed, simultaneously, a response to the asset freeze that cited the co-ownership and argued that the freeze as structured was legally incomplete since it failed to account for the full scope of marital assets, including those held through Lakeview Meridian. Daniel's attorney called Patricia within 2 hours. She let it go to voicemail. Then she called me. "He knows something's different," she said. His attorney's tone was interesting. "Interesting how?" "Careful," she said. Like someone who just realized they may not have the full picture. Good, I thought. Let that feeling grow. I want to tell you about the afternoon I met Isabelle Renard for the second time, because it was nothing like the first, and because I'd been thinking about it for weeks. I called her hotel. She was in Chicago for the month, the Streeterville condo transaction still pending, and I left a message in English saying I was Daniel's wife and I'd like to have coffee. I half expected her not to respond. She called back within the hour. We met at a cafe on Michigan Avenue on a gray Thursday morning. She arrived 3 minutes late, wearing a coat that probably cost more than our dining table, and she sat across from me with the same measuring expression I remembered from the restaurant. For 30 seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I said, in French, very quietly, "Je sais tout. I know everything." The expression that crossed her face in that moment was not what I expected. It wasn't panic. It wasn't defiance. It was something closer to exhaustion, like a woman who had been waiting for something to catch up with her and had finally heard footsteps. She looked down at her coffee. Then she said, also in French, "What do you want?" "Nothing from you," I said, and I meant it. "I want you to understand that what's about to happen is going to happen regardless, and I think you should speak to your own attorney before the end of this week." She looked up. Her eyes were sharp, but something behind them had shifted. "He told me she didn't." She stopped. "That I didn't speak French?" I said. "I know." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her cup, set it down without drinking, and said, very carefully, "The Streeterville property. My name is not on that agreement." She's protecting herself. She's already stepping back from him. "I know," I said again. "That's between you and your attorney." I left her there. I walked out into the cold Michigan Avenue wind, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in months. The specific satisfaction of a door closing at exactly the right moment. What I didn't know, walking away from that cafe, was that Daniel had already made the mistake that would seal everything. Deb called me that evening. Her voice had a quality I'd only heard from her once before, years ago, when she'd called to tell me her mother had died. That strange combination of shock and strange calm. He tried to push through the Streeterville closing, she said, this afternoon. Emergency timeline, his signature only. He can't do that, I said. I'm a co-owner. He needs my... He forged it again, she said. Elena, he did it again. 3 weeks into Patricia's motion, with a federal inquiry already, he did it again. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not from weakness, just because I needed to be low to the ground for a moment. He's scared, I realized, and scared Daniel is reckless Daniel. Deb, I said, call Patricia. Already dialing. The night before the Cook County hearing, I laid my clothes out on the chair in the corner of the bedroom. Dark navy suit, the one I'd bought for a museum board presentation 3 years ago and never worn again. I ironed it. I polished my shoes. I put the manila folder Patricia had prepared for me on the kitchen counter so I wouldn't forget it in the morning. Then I made tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. The house was quiet. Daniel had moved into a short-term rental in Lakeview 2 weeks earlier. His attorney had advised it once things became complex, which was the word everyone was using now. Complex. As if what he'd built was an interesting architectural problem rather than 11 years of my life systematically hollowed out. I thought about the woman at that dinner table in March, still hands, steady face, wine glass untouched because she didn't trust herself not to shake. She did well, I thought. She held on. I rinsed my cup. I turned off the lights. I went to bed and, for the first time in months, I slept. In the morning, I picked up the folder. I walked out the door. The Cook County Courthouse on Richard J. Daley Plaza is not a dramatic building. It's all gray stone and fluorescent light, and the particular smell of recycled air and old paper that settles into every government space eventually. People move through it the way people move through airports, purposeful, a little anxious, not looking at each other. I arrived 40 minutes early. I sat on a bench in the hallway outside courtroom 1704 and held the manila folder in my lap and watched people walk by. This is it, I thought. This is what all of it was for. Patricia arrived 12 minutes later, pulling a rolling case and talking quietly into her phone. She ended the call when she saw me, sat down beside me, and looked at my face with the specific attention of someone taking a reading. "How are you?" she asked. "Ready," I said. She nodded once. That was enough for her. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett Finch, who I'd met exactly twice, and who had the confidence of someone who had never lost a hearing he expected to win. He was expecting to win this one. I could see it in the way he walked, the way he set his briefcase on the table without looking around the room first. Daniel looked at me once, just once, across the width of the courtroom, before he sat down. I looked back. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I just held his gaze for a moment and then turned to Patricia, who was laying documents on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been here many times before. He still thinks this is a divorce proceeding, I realized. He still thinks he's managing it. Patricia had structured the hearing around 3 motions, and she'd been deliberately vague with Garrett Finch's office about the nature of the supporting documentation. Standard practice, she'd told me. You don't give the other side time to prepare a counter-narrative. The first motion addressed the asset freeze, specifically its failure to account for the assets held within Lakeview Meridian LLC. When Patricia introduced the company's full financial records, obtained through my standing as co-owner, records that Daniel's own legal strategy had made accessible to me, I watched Garrett Finch's pen stop moving on his legal pad. The records showed $4.2 million in transactions over 14 months. They showed the 3 Northside property transfers. They showed the Streeterville closing attempt from 3 weeks prior. And they showed, in the company's own internal transfer logs, payments from Lakeview Meridian to a personal account in Daniel's name that had never appeared in any of his financial disclosures to the court. Garrett Finch leaned over and said something quietly to Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened. There it is, I thought. That's the moment he realizes. The second motion was where the recording entered the room. Patricia had prepared the court for it methodically, established the legal framework, one-party consent, my presence at the dinner, the circumstances of the recording. Then she played it through a small speaker on the table. 37 seconds. Daniel's voice, clear and unhurried, explaining to Isabelle Renard exactly how the deed transfer documents should reflect my signature. The judge, a woman in her 60s, named Honorable Carla Ostrowski, who had not changed her expression once in 40 minutes, looked down at the transcript Patricia had provided and made a note. Garrett Finch requested a recess. Judge Ostrowski denied it. I stared at a fixed point on the wall above the judge's bench and breathed slowly through my nose and did not look at Daniel Webb. The third motion was the one Patricia called, in private, the closer. 3 weeks earlier, when Daniel had forged my signature on the Streeterville closing documents, panicked, reckless, certain he could still contain the situation, he had done so while a federal financial crimes inquiry was already active. The inquiry had been opened quietly in April, triggered by a tip to the FBI's Chicago field office that Patricia had helped me file. We hadn't told anyone, not Deb, not anyone. The Streeterville forgery, committed after the inquiry opened, was not a civil matter. It was not a divorce complication. It was a federal crime committed in the middle of an active investigation by a man who didn't know he was already being watched. Patricia laid the FBI case reference number on the table. Garrett Finch went very still. Daniel said quietly, "What is that?" His attorney put a hand on his arm. "I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since, and I think honesty requires me to say it wasn't what I'd imagined. I had imagined satisfaction, something hot and complete, the feeling of a door slamming shut on the right side of it. What I actually felt was quieter than that. More like the end of a long physical effort, the moment after you've carried something heavy up a long flight of stairs and you set it down and your arms just hang there, empty, relieved, a little unsure what to do next. It's done, I thought. The thing you built is real. It held." Judge Ostrowski recessed for 90 minutes. When she returned, she dissolved the asset freeze as structured, granted access to the full Lakeview Meridian records for purposes of equitable distribution, referred the forgery evidence to the State Bar Association for disciplinary review, and noted for the record that the federal matter was outside her jurisdiction, but that the court's findings would be made available to the relevant agencies. She was calm about all of it, almost administrative, as if justice, properly documented, was just a matter of reading the right things in the right order. Maybe it is. In the corridor afterward, Daniel caught up with me near the elevator bank. Garrett Finch had tried to stop him. I could see that from the way Daniel's sleeve was slightly pushed up, like someone had grabbed his arm. He'd come anyway. He stopped about 4 feet from me. He looked like he hadn't slept. There was something in his face I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not calculation. Something stripped back, raw. He said in French, "Tu savais depuis le début." You knew from the beginning. I looked at him for a moment. At the man I had driven to the airport and made coffee for, and renovated a house alongside, and believed, for 11 years, was building something with me. I answered him in French, quietly, without heat. "Non, mais j'ai appris vite." No. But I learned quickly. Then I pressed the elevator button and watched the doors open and walked in and let them close between us. I didn't look back, not because I was performing composure, but because there was genuinely nothing left in that direction worth turning around for. Here is what happened after, as plainly as I can say it. Daniel's bar license was suspended pending disciplinary review 6 weeks after the hearing. The federal inquiry expanded. Garrett Finch withdrew from the case, citing a conflict of interest, which Patricia told me happened when attorneys realized their client hadn't been honest with them about the facts. The Streeterville deal collapsed. The Lakeview Meridian assets were frozen by federal order pending the fraud investigation. The equitable distribution process was still ongoing at that point, but Patricia told me, without drama, that my position was strong. Isabelle Renard returned to Paris in June. She had, it turned out, retained her own attorney in April, 2 days after our coffee on Michigan Avenue. Whatever arrangement she had made with Daniel regarding the Streeterville property had apparently not included being exposed to federal liability. She cooperated with the inquiry. I don't know the full details, and I didn't ask. The sommelier from that Gold Coast restaurant, a man named Thierry, who had worked there for 9 years and who had overheard that dinner with the particular attentiveness of someone who loves his language and doesn't like watching it used badly, submitted a voluntary witness statement to Patricia's office in May. I hadn't asked him to. He'd heard about the proceedings through the kind of quiet professional network that exists in every industry, and he'd reached out through the restaurant. When Patricia told me, I sat with it for a long moment. Even that, I thought, even that was witnessed. I sold the Lincoln Square house in September. It was a hard thing to do and also not hard at all. The way leaving can be both at once when you've already done the leaving in every way that matters. I kept the dining table. I don't know why. It just seemed right. I found an apartment in Andersonville, on the second floor of a quiet 3-flat, with a bay window that in the mornings fills up with light. I put my books along one wall and my desk under the window and a print above it that I'd been keeping in a tube for 6 years, waiting, without knowing it, for the right room. I started a small fund, nothing formal yet, just a partnership with a nonprofit on the Northwest Side, for women navigating divorce who can't afford the kind of legal help that changes outcomes. It isn't much. It's something. Some evenings I walk over to a French restaurant on Clark Street, where the owner knows me now and keeps a corner table that I've started to think of as mine. I order in French. He nods. We talk sometimes about nothing in particular, the neighborhood, the weather, what's good that week. It's a small thing, but it's mine, completely, uncomplicated, mine. Last week I opened a new notebook, just a plain one, from the drugstore on Foster Avenue. I wrote my name on the first page, Elena Marie Webb. Then I thought about it for a moment, took out a pen, and crossed out Webb, not with anger, just with the quiet, deliberate motion of a woman deciding what she's carrying forward and what she's setting down. I'm still figuring out what the next chapter looks like. That's okay. I've learned I'm better at building things slowly than I used to give myself credit for. I've thought a lot about what I would have done if the recording hadn't existed, if my phone had been in my purse instead of my pocket that night. If I'd ordered differently and reached for a bread roll instead of a water glass at exactly the wrong moment, I think about how close it all came to being a completely different story, and I find myself wondering about you, whether you've ever held something painful for a very long time, waiting for the moment you could finally set it down. Whether you've ever had to decide between the easier thing and the right thing, knowing the right thing was going to cost you more than you could fully calculate. I don't know what you would have done in my place, but I'd like to. If you could go back to that dinner table, knowing everything, would you have stayed silent, or would you have spoken?